The operation was sold to the American public as swift, decisive, and necessary, a precision move, a bold strike to enforce justice. But behind the dramatic headlines and triumphant podium speeches, the numbers are now telling a very different story. According to recent defense expenditure analyses and reporting from major financial outlets, the true cost of the U.S. military deployment tied to the Venezuela operation may be approaching and potentially exceeding $3 billion. Not $3 million, not $300 million, $3 billion. And that number is sending shockwaves through Washington. When U.S. forces moved against Venezuelan leader Nicolás Maduro earlier this year, the narrative from the White House framed the mission as a tightly controlled operation aimed at dismantling alleged narcotics networks and enforcing long-standing sanctions. Officials described it as part of a broader counter-narcotics and regional stabilization strategy. But what unfolded was far more extensive than a limited raid. Carrier strike groups repositioned. Amphibious assault ships entered the Caribbean theater. Marine expeditionary units stood on alert. Surveillance aircraft intensified patrols. Intelligence assets were redirected. The scale of force projection was not symbolic. It was substantial. Maintaining a single U.S. aircraft carrier strike group can cost upwards of $6 to $8 million per day depending on operational tempo. When factoring in air wing sorties, fuel consumption, logistics chains, maintenance cycles, personnel allowances, hazard pay, and support vessels, that daily burn rate climbs significantly. Analysts tracking open-source deployment data estimate that sustained naval presence and rotational support in the Caribbean over multiple weeks pushed total operational expenses into the billions. Even if some vessels were already on scheduled deployment cycles, the intensified operational tempo and mission-specific costs add layers of financial weight that do not simply vanish into existing budgets. The public rarely sees how rapidly overseas deployments escalate in cost. A destroyer operating offshore may cost tens of thousands of dollars per hour to run when factoring in fuel, crew, and maintenance allocation. Fighter jet sorties can exceed $30,000 per flight hour depending on platform. ISR aircraft, intelligence, surveillance, reconnaissance add their own multi-million-dollar footprint over extended periods. Satellite tasking, secure communications networks, and classified special operations logistics often remain outside publicly detailed accounting. Experts warn that when those elements are eventually tallied, the $3 billion estimate may prove conservative. The justification presented to the American people was clear: disrupt criminal networks, hold Maduro accountable for alleged corruption and drug trafficking charges, and protect regional stability. But critics argue the scale of military mobilization looked less like counter-narcotics enforcement and more like a strategic, geopolitical message. The presence of high-value naval assets in the Caribbean signaled power projection well beyond the arrest of a single leader. It was a demonstration of capability, and demonstrations of capability are rarely inexpensive. International reaction was immediate and divided. Several U.S. allies supported accountability measures, citing years of sanctions violations and governance concerns inside Venezuela. Others condemned the action as a violation of sovereignty and warned of destabilizing precedent. Latin American leaders, particularly in Brazil, Mexico, and Colombia, expressed concern over escalation. Diplomats referenced the United Nations Charter and long-standing regional norms against unilateral military intervention. The political cost began stacking alongside the financial one. Then came the oil dimension. Venezuela holds the world's largest proven oil reserves. For years, sanctions had limited its ability to fully access global markets. Following the operation, reports indicated renewed discussions about Venezuelan crude flowing toward U.S. refineries under transitional arrangements. Energy analysts estimated that billions of dollars in potential oil transactions could materialize if infrastructure rehabilitation advanced. Supporters of the operation argue that stabilizing oil flows could help offset costs and reduce global supply volatility. Critics counter that rebuilding Venezuela's deteriorated energy infrastructure would require massive capital injections, potentially in the hundreds of billions over time, dwarfing any short-term revenue gains. At home, the fiscal optics are complicated. The United States national debt has surpassed $38 trillion. Interest payments alone consume a growing portion of the federal budget. Against that backdrop, revelations of a multi-billion-dollar foreign deployment, even one framed as strategically justified, ignite scrutiny. Lawmakers from both parties have demanded clearer cost breakdowns. Budget hawks question sustainability. Defense advocates argue deterrence requires investment. The debate is no longer hypothetical, it is line-item specific. What makes the controversy sharper is the timeline. Initial public messaging emphasized speed and efficiency. The word surgical appeared repeatedly in early briefings. Yet sustained deployments are inherently cumulative in cost. Even a few extra days at sea for major naval assets can add tens of millions. Multiply that by weeks of elevated readiness posture, layered support assets, and parallel intelligence operations, and the total swells quickly. Some defense analysts stress that global force posture is dynamic, that ships and aircraft were not dispatched from scratch solely for this mission. They argue the marginal cost may be lower than headline figures suggest. Others disagree, pointing to incremental fuel loads, munitions positioning, hazard allowances, and accelerated maintenance cycles triggered by operational intensity. The truth likely sits somewhere between base deployment cost and mission-driven escalation, but even conservative accounting pushes the figure into the multi-billion-dollar range. There is also the opportunity cost. Resources allocated to one theater cannot simultaneously reinforce another without strain. Critics argue that diverting high-end naval assets to the Caribbean, even temporarily, carries ripple effects for Indo-Pacific posture and European deterrence operations. Supporters insist flexibility is precisely what U.S. naval power is designed to provide. Still, readiness has a price, and readiness extended is readiness build. The political ramifications are unfolding in real time. Supporters of the administration describe the operation as a bold assertion of U.S. resolve. They argue that failing to act would embolden sanctioned regimes and undermine credibility. Opponents warn that normalization of cross-border force to detain foreign leaders could destabilize international norms and invite reciprocal behavior globally. In that framing, the cost is not only monetary but systemic. Financial markets reacted cautiously rather than explosively, but defense sector stocks experienced noticeable volatility during peak operational days. Energy markets watched closely for signals regarding Venezuelan crude flows. Insurance premiums for regional shipping adjusted modestly amid uncertainty. While no global financial crisis emerged from the operation, the episode highlighted how quickly regional military maneuvers intersect with economic confidence. Meanwhile, inside Washington, auditors and oversight committees are requesting briefings. Classified components of the operation complicate transparency. Historically, final cost assessments for overseas military engagements take months, sometimes years, to fully calculate. Supplemental appropriations bills may absorb some figures. Others will be embedded within broader Pentagon budget adjustments. By the time a final ledger emerges, public attention may have shifted, but the debt accounting will remain. The administration continues to defend the mission as necessary, proportionate, and strategically beneficial. Officials emphasize that deterrence cannot be measured solely in dollars. They argue that dismantling alleged criminal networks tied to sanctioned leadership protects American communities indirectly. Critics reply that measurable results must justify measurable expenditure. With a number like $3 billion circulating in headlines, that burden of proof intensifies. What began as a dramatic geopolitical event has evolved into a fiscal debate layered atop a diplomatic controversy. And as more analysts scrutinize operational footprints, ship tracking data, flight activity, procurement surges, the emerging picture suggests the price tag was never going to be modest. Whether it ultimately lands at $3 billion slightly below or meaningfully above, the symbolic threshold has already been crossed in public perception. The question now is not only whether the operation succeeded tactically, it is whether its strategic return will outweigh the financial, diplomatic, and political costs. In Washington, that calculation is ongoing. In Caracas, the consequences are still unfolding. And for American taxpayers, the number attached to this mission may linger long after the ships have sailed home. And as scrutiny intensifies, a deeper question is beginning to dominate conversations inside policy circles. What exactly did the United States buy for $3 billion? Because in Washington, cost is rarely judged in isolation. It is judged against outcome, against leverage gained, against deterrence achieved, against risk reduced. And here, the answers are far more complicated than the early headlines suggested. Supporters of the operation argue that the removal of Nicolás Maduro from power represents a seismic shift in Western Hemisphere geopolitics. For years, Maduro's government operated under heavy U.S. sanctions, accused by American prosecutors of narco-terrorism, corruption, and enabling illicit trafficking networks. Indictments had been unsealed, rewards had been offered, sanctions tightened, yet the regime endured. From that perspective, the operation achieved what years of economic pressure could not: decisive action. But critics counter that capturing a head of state through direct military intervention crosses a threshold that reshapes diplomatic norms. They warn that even if one views the mission as morally justified, the precedent it sets may echo in ways Washington cannot fully control. If powerful nations normalize unilateral action to detain foreign leaders, what stops rivals from invoking similar justifications in their own spheres of influence? That strategic question does not show up on a Pentagon invoice, but it carries weight far beyond a budget line. Financially, the $3 billion estimate represents only visible operational expenditures. Carrier deployment costs, air sorties, marine expeditionary readiness, logistics chains, ISR expansion, maritime patrol intensification. What is less visible are the downstream expenses. Accelerated maintenance cycles for naval vessels reduce long-term service life and require earlier overhaul. Aircraft that fly at elevated operational tempo require increased component replacement and inspection intervals. Munitions repositioned for contingency readiness must be replenished. Those costs often surface months later in supplemental procurement requests. Defense budget experts explain that when a carrier strike group operates in high readiness posture, wear and tear compounds, reactor operations, catapult cycles, jet engine hours, radar system strain, each element accumulates maintenance liability. Even if the deployment window appears short in news coverage, the mechanical footprint stretches well beyond the visible timeline. Multiply that by multiple ships and air assets, and deferred maintenance becomes future appropriation pressure. Then there is personnel cost, hazard pay adjustments, extended deployment bonuses, temporary duty reassignments, intelligence surge staffing, secure communications expansion, cyber defense monitoring spikes. When geopolitical tensions rise, the invisible layers of defense architecture activate simultaneously. That activation is expensive. Some analysts also point to insurance adjustments in global maritime markets. During peak uncertainty in the Caribbean, shipping insurers recalibrated risk premiums for certain routes. Even modest increases ripple into energy pricing models and commodity shipment costs. Although the effect was temporary, it demonstrated how military action in one region can influence global trade microeconomics almost instantly. The oil calculus remains perhaps the most debated element of the entire episode. Venezuela's proven oil reserves are estimated at over 300 billion barrels, the largest in the world. However, production capacity has deteriorated dramatically over the past decade due to underinvestment, sanctions, infrastructure decay, and management issues. Before sanctions tightened, Venezuela produced over 2 million barrels per day. In recent years, output fell dramatically below that level. Rehabilitating extraction fields, pipelines, and refineries requires enormous capital. Energy economists estimate that restoring Venezuela to even partial historic production levels could require tens of billions in near-term investment and far more over the long run. Supporters of the operation argue that long-term access to stable Venezuelan crude supply could strengthen U.S. energy security and reduce dependence on adversarial supply chains. They frame the deployment cost as an upfront investment in hemispheric stability. Critics respond that oil markets are complex, diversified, and globally priced. They question whether military intervention meaningfully shifts structural supply dynamics or merely injects short-term volatility. Domestically, the political dimension is sharpening as election cycles approach. Lawmakers have begun requesting classified briefings to understand the precise operational scope. Oversight committees are pressing for cost transparency. Fiscal conservatives emphasize the national debt trajectory, now exceeding $38 trillion, with annual interest payments alone rivaling major federal program expenditures. They argue that every billion spent abroad must be justified against domestic priorities: infrastructure, healthcare, social programs, disaster recovery. Defense advocates counter that deterrence failures cost more than deterrence investments. They cite historical examples where delayed action led to prolonged conflict and exponentially higher financial burden. From their perspective, decisive posture prevents greater escalation. The argument is philosophical as much as fiscal. Is it cheaper to project strength early or to respond to instability later? Internationally, reaction remains mixed. Some governments view the operation as a reaffirmation of U.S. willingness to enforce sanctions and pursue accountability. Others see it as evidence of a unilateral impulse that could destabilize multilateral frameworks. The United Nations Security Council held emergency discussions. Regional blocs in Latin America debated formal responses. While no coordinated counteraction materialized, diplomatic tensions simmer. Meanwhile, global rivals are studying the precedent closely. Strategic planners in Beijing and Moscow analyze not only the military mechanics, but the political aftermath. They examine how Washington absorbs backlash, how markets respond, how Congress reacts, how public opinion evolves. In modern geopolitics, perception management is as critical as operational execution. Another dimension often overlooked is intelligence expenditure. Prior to any overt action, months of surveillance, cyber monitoring, human intelligence development, and strategic assessment typically precede deployment. Those preparatory phases involve classified budgets. By the time visible assets move into theater, significant funding has already been committed. That pre-operational layer rarely enters public debate, yet it is foundational to the mission's feasibility. Some policy analysts argue the $3 billion figure, while dramatic, must be contextualized within the broader $800+ billion annual U.S. defense budget. They note that large-scale training exercises can cost billions annually without direct conflict. From that vantage point, the Venezuela deployment represented a fractional allocation of total defense resources. However, symbolism matters. When a single regional operation accumulates a multi-billion-dollar price tag, headlines amplify perception regardless of proportionality. Public opinion polling in the weeks following the operation reflected divided sentiment. Some Americans expressed support for holding sanctioned leaders accountable. Others voiced concern over intervention fatigue and fiscal strain. The American public has experienced decades of overseas engagements: Iraq, Afghanistan, counterterrorism operations, and appetite for new entanglements is cautious. Strategically, the administration maintains that the mission was limited in scope and duration, designed to achieve a specific objective, rather than initiate prolonged occupation or regime building. Officials emphasize that U.S. ground presence inside Venezuela was not expansive or sustained. Naval and air posture, they argue, was precautionary to ensure mission security. Whether that explanation satisfies skeptics depends largely on future developments. If escalation remains contained, the operation may be remembered as bold but finite. If instability deepens, scrutiny will intensify. Financial oversight bodies are now tracking supplemental budget adjustments. If replenishment funds are requested to cover munitions, accelerated maintenance, or readiness restoration, those numbers will surface in congressional appropriations debates. Historically, the true cost of military engagements crystallizes gradually through budget revisions rather than immediate disclosure. Energy markets continue monitoring Venezuelan output signals. If transitional authorities increase crude exports toward U.S. refineries, revenue streams may partially offset sanctions-era disruptions. Yet, infrastructure modernization will require partnership with international energy firms. Investment climate stability will depend on governance legitimacy and political predictability, variables still in flux. What remains undeniable is that the phrase $3 billion has entered the public narrative. Whether final audited costs land slightly below or above that estimate, the perception of a multi-billion-dollar deployment is embedded in discourse. In political communication, perception shapes debate as powerfully as precise accounting. The broader strategic doctrine question is emerging as well. Is the United States recalibrating toward more assertive enforcement of sanctions through kinetic leverage? Or was this a singular case tied to specific indictments and intelligence assessments? Allies and adversaries alike are parsing that signal. Consistency in future posture will determine how this episode is interpreted historically. As months pass, historians and defense economists will analyze the Venezuela operation alongside other limited engagements. They will evaluate cost efficiency, geopolitical ripple effects, energy implications, and normative impact. They will measure whether deterrence strengthened or eroded. They will examine whether financial expenditure translated into measurable security gain.
For now, Washington sits at a crossroads of narrative and numbers. The administration defends decisiveness. Critics demand transparency. Markets watch quietly. Rivals assess implications. Taxpayers process the headline figure. $3 billion is more than a number. It is a symbol of projection, of controversy, of power, of cost. Whether history records it as a strategic investment or an expensive gamble will depend on outcomes still unfolding. What is certain is this: the Venezuela operation has reshaped conversation about American force, fiscal limits, and global precedent. The ships may have repositioned. The immediate tension may have cooled. But the financial and strategic aftershocks continue to ripple outward quietly, steadily, influencing debates that will define U.S. foreign policy long after the initial raid faded from breaking news banners. And in Washington, the ledger remains open.